So hello everyone, and well, thank you for listening to this session. Also, thank you for the organizers for putting this up. I'm Merschroth. I'm about to graduate in geography from the University of Vienna. And presenting on behalf of all authors today, my presentation centers around the roles of subjectivity and social positioning for habitability perceptions in the light of environmental change. This paper builds on recent fieldwork in northern Ghana that I did together with Janoth, who will also present later today in this session. So let's jump right into it. The starting point of our paper is that we observed kind of an assessment gap when it comes to works on habitability and environmental change. So on the one hand, we have several works on habitability that kind of like classify habitability objectively and mainly based on natural or material parameters only. This generalizes habitability. On the other hand, we know from literature that the impact of environmental change is actually very heterogeneous, even when people live in the very same place. So the argument I'm going to make today is that three aspects matter for habitability, though they have yet received little attention. These aspects are subjectivity, social position, as well as space and time. Before we get to the case study, let's clear up a few key terms that we're talking about. When I talk about habitability, I refer to the property of a place to afford people to pursue a healthy, meaningful, and dignified life. We thus see habitability as dynamic and continuous, as subject to multiple truths, and embedded in broader political ecologies, meaning in links to space and time, but also power relations. We also build our work on aspects of intersectionality, meaning that we understand social categories as constructed, as interacting, and in a translation into social practices. And lastly, social practices are understood in line with Pierre Bourdieu, understanding them as an individual's actions and behaviors, and thereby as illustrating power on the one hand, and the capacity to respond to environmental change on the other hand. So just shortly, on the research side, it's located in northern Ghana. We have a rainy and a dry season. Most people follow subsistence farming, and some support this by retailing, by sun fetching, by pickup driving. Generally speaking, social practices are quite hierarchically structured, particularly along the intersection of gender, age, and socioeconomic status. And in line with the modernization process that happened in the community in the past 20 years, for instance, the introduction of electricity and water pumps, the population has also been growing constantly. This in turn has contributed to land scarcity and declining soil fertility. And another environmental change that was reported to us as affecting people's livelihoods was an increase in erratic rainfall patterns. We implemented a gender and social equity sensitive approach for this work as suggested by Lisa Signestam and Sarah Wiegel. And this approach helped us to focus on the subjectivity and habitability perceptions, as well as on the role of power, which is reflected in social practices. We applied several qualitative methods, expert interviews, key informant interviews, transect walks, focus group discussions, and semi-structured interviews. Sampling was done purposefully to make sure that we do reflect a wide range of intersecting social categories within our sample. And lastly, we applied a qualitative content analysis. So let's talk about the results, about the evidence. The collective narratives on habitability showed that habitability is generally very high in the community. Yet individual level interviews showed that habitability is much more variegated. While things like livelihoods and place attachment were commonly named indicators for habitability, we also observed some very individual factors, such as the health of children or cultural practices. This said, habitability is subjective. By tendency, those with medium to high socioeconomic status, those with some sort of education and a medium age, with supporting social networks and diversified livelihoods, this kind of like group of people tended to express higher habitability in comparison to those who do not fall into these categories. Looking at gender and particularly, this kind of like category has to be strongly embedded into the intersection of the other social categories I just mentioned. And consequently, we see that habitability is socially differentiated. So overall, habitability is not static. It was reported to have changed over time, both short and long-term periods, in both positive and negative directions. This said, habitability is dynamic and in our case also seasonal. Adding to that, we have several factors that contributed to increases and decreases in habitability. And these factors are multidimensional and also differing from person to person. If you look at environmental change in particular, most participants reported some degree of negative influence on their habitability, yet in a wide range. So this influence included, for example, decreased food security or less access to health or education. The example of Salva nicely illustrates this. She lives in a rather poor household. She's a middle-aged woman with many young female children and with a husband who has little land due to his previous migration history and due to previous changes in his social status. So this household cannot deal with environmental change sufficiently. Salva told us, for instance, that environmental change affects my social relations. When you're invited to a ceremony, you're expected to bring a gift. We cannot go because we cannot afford this. This leads to others coming to our own ceremonies less. My status decreases and I like it less in the community. I do not like walking around here anymore. Overall, it is not comfortable for me here and now. This example also shows that the impact of environmental change goes far beyond material aspects of habitability. I'm now going to give some short insights into the social practices that actually mediate the differentiated habitability perceptions that I've just illustrated. We can observe three clusters here, namely the diversification of livelihood, the capacity to cope and adapt within agriculture, and the access and control over resources, over space and food time. Of course, these naturally overlap with one another to a certain degree. When we talk about livelihood diversification, we refer, for instance, to operating a business, which depends on financial and human capital to start it, but also to aspects of labor division, such as care work, to have time to operate a business. Also, intra-household decision-making plays a role here. As for example, as a female, you often have to be allowed by your husband to operate this business. Looking at social practices in agriculture, the usage of fertilizer and machinery is, of course, very prominent. To do so, to follow this, one needs sufficient social and financial capital, though. Also, for example, following crop rotation, which we observe to be one adaptation strategy to environmental changes, requires knowledge, but it also requires time and physical strength. And moreover, this capacity to cope and adapt within agriculture depends on land ownership and again on intra-household labor division dynamics, such as having enough time to invest more into agriculture. Lastly, looking at resources across space and time. This includes the access to fertilizer from different places, the access to remittances, to land in different places, and to knowledge transfers. And all these depend very strongly on social and financial capital, as well as on place connectivity, but also on past happenings, such as one's upbringing and the education potentially connected to that upbringing. That said, our work shows that the intersection of various social categories characterizes through the translation to social practices how environmental change impacts habitability. These intersections include a very wide range of social categories and cannot be generalized. Yet the most prominent in our study were education, gender, age, household composition, and socioeconomic status. Our results strongly contrast assessments that are based on material factors only, meaning that habitability research should, on the one hand, go beyond environmental factors only, but also include non-material factors. We thus do support that habitability is subject to multiple truths rather than to one objective truth. And lastly, the conceptualization of habitability would profit from insights of feminist political ecology and translocality, as these concepts allow integrating the roles of power, but also of space and time properly. So to conclude, our study aims on filling an assessment gap, which forms between objective habitability assessments on one hand and heterogeneous experiences of environmental change on the other hand. We did so by building on a qualitative field study in rural northern Ghana, drawing on an intersectionally differentiated understanding of habitability here. Our results show that the intersection of gender, age, socioeconomic status, and household composition translates into social practices that shape a socially differentiated experience of habitability. And we also saw that this perception is influenced by place connectivity and very personal notions of habitability. So coming back to our key argument, we conclude that habitability is subjective and that it's characterized through an actor's position within a socio-ecological system. And this means that even though environmental stress might be spread very homogeneously in one region, the impact of that stress on habitability will not be uniform. This implies that the social dimension matters for habitability assessments. And understanding this and understanding this heterogeneity is crucial to really implement policies and climate change adaptation policies that enable empowering change rather than running the risk to kind of like reproduce existing inequalities. And yeah, that's it from my side. These are the references I refer to, and I hand it back over to you, Jennifer, I guess. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Simon. And we'll hold all the questions until the end, and I'll help to facilitate questions that come in online as well. Now, if we could turn it over to, and I apologize with names, Ariadna from the University of Antwerp. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jennifer. Hi, everyone. Everyone online and in New York. I'm based in San Francisco, so it's still a bit early for me in the morning. Let me get my PowerPoint up. No, share screen, sorry. Can you see my screen? Yes. I take that as a confirmation. Hi, everyone. So thanks for having me here today. My name is Ariadna Anisimov, and I am currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Antwerp. The title of my presentation today, Habitability and Loss and Damage at the Science Policy Interface, Bridging Local Experiences in International Negotiations, draws a lot from my experience working in policy for many years before coming back to academia. So I will be presenting today a bit of framing and case studies. So one case study I've already carried out and another case study that I'm planning to do. It's been very busy with the loss and damage policy space at the moment. So it will be great to have a discussion and some feedback on future field work on this pertinent issue. So I'll be focusing on four key areas. Who defines habitability? I won't be defining it today, but the path towards institutionalizing a definition raises some key concerns, especially given, as we see Simon's presentation, place-based specificities and power structures and inequalities. Second, how does habitability or rather inhabitability, a feature of loss and damage and the recent policy spaces, especially funding for loss and damage, how does it fit into that? Thirdly, what can we learn from case studies, specifically the root drivers of vulnerability as a function of habitability? And finally, how to engage in bottom-up approaches such as adaptation pathways that can help to identify different adaptation options over time, thresholds, social acceptability levels, and different cultural visions and perceptions of habitability. So researching habitability lies somewhere at the intersections of top-down and bottom-up approaches. So while climate projections are important, we understand that social qualitative understanding of capacities, acceptability levels are fundamental. Similarly, the concepts of adaptation limits reflect this dichotomy. Environmental thresholds are very relevant for when we think about species and habitats, also climate-related or climate-sensitive livelihoods. But this is at the socio-ecological system, we understand that there is agency, so the role of values and perceptions of different actors, the preferences and needs of people change and their ability to adapt. And I relate this to soft limits, so those that potentially can be overcome. So habitability, or rather inhabitability, is somewhere at the intersections or crossroads of these different limits and interacting in the associated losses and damages. Because of my interest in losses and damages, I took a deeper look at how they are dealt with in the latest IPCC Working Group 2 report. And here I compiled a table of all the text in the report and a few key that mentions losses and damages, and a few key features came out that I think relate a lot to also when we discuss habitability conditions. First, there's a time scale element. So we understand that there's near term and long term. And so there's a question about urgent rapid changes and long-term habitability. Second, that there is complex compounding risks. So there's systemic dynamics from the local to national and even global level. And these processes are important when we think about not only limits and losses and damages, but what does that mean for habitability? And thirdly, we come back to this hard and soft limits. Specifically, soft narrows in on capacities and resources such as financing, which can influence habitability and maybe even make it or break it. So it's only critical that the latest COP27 decision addresses a major climate finance gap, which is with the decision to establish a new funding mechanism to respond to loss and damage. And the key question now is new resources to fund what on the ground and for whom. In these high level negotiations, there's a lot of discussion on how to operationalize the funding for loss and damage, and some windows have been proposed by civil society, as you can see on the left side. But the key question is also about the local scale. So how to empower local communities in adaptation planning that are facing limits, loss and damage, and habitability questions, so that this fund is about meeting their needs, voices, and visions of the future. In this way, ground-rooted insights are very important, which is where I will be going to now. What does this mean in real-world case studies? I'll give two examples that showed very different scales of the problem that we are discussing today. This first case is at a community scale in a community called Rivière de Galets on the Mauritius Island in the Indian Ocean. I carried out fieldwork here in 2019 and came across this community with a big poster board right along the road that said the Adaptation Fund had been here. This community of 140 people living in poverty with no basic facilities are at the edge of this coastline facing repeated flooding, erosion, and extreme events. In 2012, UNDP had a country project with Mauritius and selected the site as critical. So based on their evaluation documents, one might even ask if they deemed it inhabitable. UNDP and the Ministry of Environment in Mauritius proposed two options to the community. One was to rebuild the seawall and reinforce protective structures at a cost of 2.8 million. And the second option was relocation of the community a bit inland. After a year of raising awareness initiatives with the community and carrying out surveys, more than 50% of the community refused the second option, which was this planned retreat or relocation, mainly due to cultural ties to the land, but also distrust in the institutions and place-based identities. So in 2016, the wall was rebuilt to protect the community with no certainty about the future funding for maintenance of this structural measure or any kind of engagement in forward-looking adaptive options such as building capacities or flexibility in the future. So my key question about this case is about habitability of this site and for these people and their vision of the future. The root drivers of vulnerability were never addressed, meaning why are they marginalized and exposed in the first place? A second case, which is a little bit different, is a larger scale, which brings habitability, sorry, it's a tough word, to the limelight, is Barbuda. So I'm preparing field work here in the coming month to look at a different type of case study. Here we have Hurricane Irma that came in 2017. When Hurricane Irma was about to land on the island, authorities of the sister island Antigua forcefully evacuated the entire population of Barbuda. Barbudans were not allowed to return for several weeks to the island in the name that it was deemed a health hazard. So we could say, potentially, another feature of inhabitability. In the wake of the disaster, the Antiguan government started to put pressure on the Communal Land Act that was in Barbuda by reversing it. So Barbudans have historically managed the land collectively, meaning they decide together on major developments. However, Antigua wanted to push for development in Barbuda to increase tourism and financial revenues. So this was all done in the name of sustainable development. And now that there are companies building up ecotourism results on the island, there's destruction of the environment, dismantling land tenure relations and cultural heritage of the people of Barbuda. And even more, the tourism dependency trap has shown several small island developing states are exposed to external shocks, such as the pandemic, and the tourism economy is just one, but also the cycles of rebuilding and constructing after cyclical extreme events and dependency on international development actors, loans, and private sector investments. So otherwise, this could be labeled a case of disaster capitalism and land grabbing, but it's also important to understand the options available for this community have shifted and are changing, notably loss of empowerment, their visions of adaptation, and how they might be facing increasingly soft and hard limits to adaptation. So while the island was deemed inhabitable after the hurricane for the local community, it seems to be becoming habitable for seasonal tourists. And this brings me back to the point of soft limits and the capacities to adapt. But further, who defines vulnerability gives power to making decisions, and there was the winners and losers of adaptation. So I think that, looking at habitability is very important to think about the root drivers of vulnerability and what that means for adaptation limits and forward-looking sort of changing conditions of habitability, as Simon had mentioned, is dynamic. We have heard quite a bit about capabilities, capacities, and a keynote speaker on Tuesday highlighted this critical component, notably to support moving away from environmental determinism as the sole defining feature of habitability. There's more than risk thresholds and local dynamics, as we see in socioecological systems. We should also be looking at global dynamics and politics having a role in reaching certain limits. And this is things like the debt crisis and the cost of capital, climate finance gaps, and exploitative maladaptive pathways, as we've seen with the case with Barbuda. So there's also places with decreasing solution spaces whereby inhabitable is not about future trajectories, but present day realities. So against this backdrop, I propose a few ways forward. I think developing further conceptual frameworks and this idea of flexible taxonomies is very important. So looking more at defining what are different types of adaptation limits, the relevant losses and damages, and what does that mean for habitability in different contexts. And that should be flexible and ground rooted, as we've seen because of, thanks to Simon's presentation, the importance of subjectivity in understanding habitability. And to think more about the use of adaptation pathways, so really bottom-up approaches that allow participation from community members and different actors to think about exploring adaptation options along timescales, and identifying the trade-offs. So also the acceptability levels of different adaptation options, and understanding that in the context of habitability can prepare for future losses and damages, especially as habitability can be changing, what kind of options are available, and what does that mean for habitability short, medium, and long term. Thank you very much. I look forward to any questions and the discussion following all the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now I turn it over to Jan from the University of Vienna.
Yes, thank you. I'll just share my screen. I hope you can hear me well. 1 second. Okay, I hope this works. Great. Yeah, so thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be presenting here today. Unfortunately, I can't be in New York, but it's indeed a very long way. But nevertheless, I'm very excited to present the impact of migration on culturally embedded perceptions of habitability in a context of environmental change in northern Ghana. And this was a study I conducted as part of my master thesis in northern Ghana in the last summer, about 6 weeks of fieldwork. It was embedded in the Habitable project and also involved, of course, cooperation between University of Vienna and University of Ghana. So a quick look at the situation. So I'm sure you're all very much aware that environmental change is increasingly posing challenges to all of us, and increasingly so for resource-dependent societies. And climate change will redefine the relationships people have with place. A very interesting quote.
Jan, hold on one. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but if you could put it into presentation mode so that the slide fills the screen and you can advance it from there.
I think it should be in the presentation mode, no?
No, yeah, try that.
Does this work?
So we're able to see all of the slides on the left.
Okay, because I am actually in the presentation mode.
You have to go in it first and then screen share. Oh, so go out of screen share and go into the presentation mode and then share your screen.
Yes. Okay. 1 second now. Okay, does it work now?
No, so stop sharing press the stop share button at the top in Zoom.
Yes.
And then we should not see, there we go. Okay, now share again, the full presentation mode.
Okay, how do I do that? Just in...
So now in Zoom, share screen, and then select the presentation again.
Yes.
In the screen share mode, yes.
I'm really sorry.
It's okay, no pressure.
Okay, so now you can see all the slides, right?
Don't just have him go and advance the slides in the left-hand pane as he goes, but you have to do that.
Okay, you'll have to manually advance the slides through the left column there in the left-hand pane, but it's fine, just go ahead.
Okay, so like this it works, or...
Just tell him he's still on the title page.
You're on the title page, so yeah, click on
Yeah.
2. Yes, that's what
Okay.
you'll need to do.
Perfect. All right, yeah, sorry about that. But anyways, so I found this very interesting quote from Fresk, Baxter, and Armitage back in 2012, stating that climate change will redefine the relationships people have with place. And this is indeed very relevant because we're exactly talking about these relationships of people and place and how kind of social units can render places habitable. And as a result, also the habitability of places, of course, becomes an increasing issue of concern. And kind of instead of utilizing those kind of prevalent approaches to habitability and also the origins of habitability from a biophysical standpoint, so rather utilizing objectively measurable data as the key to habitability, I think it's really important to really dig on this people-place relationship, and then also, as Simon just presented previously, to view habitability indeed as an issue of perception. So for our conceptual approach, we thus use, or I'm leaning on the thoughts of colleague Harald Sterly, who has also been presenting at the conference already, as defining habitability as the material or immaterial properties of places to afford a certain way of pursuing livelihoods that is linked to the ability of individuals, households, and communities to sustain a living and their perceived understanding of well-being. And so this understanding of habitability then is, of course, and Simon told us this already, subjective, and habitability can be perceived differently. And habitability, of course, is based on material properties of places. So here the means to sustain a living, which perhaps comes closest to these objectively measurable data like climate data, soil quality data, or vegetation indices. And habitability, on the other hand, is also based on immaterial and subjectively perceived properties of places. So, for example, how kind of attached people are to certain places, how they are affiliated to places, and of course, how they perceive a place to be habitable or not. And ultimately, these perceptions of habitability then are embedded in their respective social-cultural context. And I want to dive a little bit deeper into this notion of culturally embedded and subjective perceptions of habitability, again, using the thoughts of Harald Sterly, stating members of a pastoralist society with traditional livelihoods and culturally embedded needs and identities might consider a dryland savanna as habitable, which, however, might be regarded as virtually uninhabitable for farmers. So, for example, if you take the case of the Tuareg in the Sahel or Sahara, for them and their also social cultural embedding, this place is perfectly habitable. For me, for example, I think it would be very difficult to sustain a livelihood long-term in the Sahel, for example. Moving to the role of migration. So ultimately, I'm looking at how migration is indeed impacting perceptions of habitability and what kind of role migration plays. And migration has a double-tracked relationship with habitability because migration, on the one hand, is informed by the habitability of a given place. So, for example, if environmental conditions get continuously worse, perhaps more people opt for migration. But on the other hand, migration can also impact the habitability of a place. So through remittances, for example, also agricultural innovations and ideas, migration can have an impact on perceptions of habitability. And ultimately, this leads to the predication that migration can shift perceptions of habitability by also influencing the underlying socio-cultural context. Migration can, through its influence, lead to socio-cultural changes. And these socio-cultural changes also then contribute to shifting perceptions of habitability. Quick look then at the methods and study design. So we did a place-based study, meaning just looking at one community in particular, and perception-based, meaning that we really focused on respondents' perceptions of habitability and how the habitability of their community has developed. Also, of course, how they perceive environmental change. And indeed, environmental change was the very important negative kind of factor for their perceptions of habitability, with repeated droughts and floods, with a decline in soil fertility and also erratic rainfalls, which is also why we kind of have the study in the context of environmental change. And it was a qualitative mixed method study using semi-structured interviews, expert key informant interviews, focus group discussions, transect walks, and participatory walking journals, as you can see in the image below. And in total, 45 of those methods were conducted. Good, then jumping to the results of the study very quickly. So again, to reiterate, I was focusing on the impacts of migration on perceptions of habitability. And here, very importantly, I was using kind of a social cultural lens, meaning that these perceptions of habitability are shaped by the respective social cultural context. And first, I was looking at community cohesion, and community cohesion indeed is very important for perceptions of habitability. You can imagine when a community is kind of closely together and has lots of support systems, people will perceive the place to be more habitable. And migration indeed was a major driver for a loss of cohesion, of course, through the absence of community members. For example, one respondent stated, "Migration is a temporal death or loss of a loved one. We have lost a loved one. You are now not enjoying the same quality of life and it hurts." A very kind of emphatic statement where the loss of cohesion is equal with also a loss in the quality of life. And also in the community, we have a very strong presence of seasonal migration, especially after the harvesting season. Many people migrate out and then come back. But also these return migrants contribute to alter community structures. They introduce new lifestyles and slowly tear the existing social structures apart. In addition, migration also leads to a general decline of communal labor and intra-community activities, and especially for the most vulnerable, it's also a loss of vital safety nets and support systems. For example, when all of them go, the community becomes like an empty shell. The community is empty and nobody is there, so it is very bad for my quality of life, and it decreases the value of the place. And here, all of the participants or respondents had quite a unique and unified opinion that indeed the loss of cohesion affects perceptions of habitability negatively. Secondly, I was looking at place attachment, again, a very important social cultural dimension in northern Ghana, and people are strongly attached to their home community and have a strong feeling of belonging. For example, it's even considered a shame if you don't own a house in the community of your father. And migration then can alter feelings of attachment. For example, the absence of community members can evolve sentiments of loss for those that remain behind and sentiments of homesickness for the migrants themselves. For example, when you are away for longer times, you feel a loss of home, you lose your identity. So here again, a very strong statement where again here the place and place-based identities and migration are in a relationship, which then of course also affect how people view places as habitable or not. Kind of interesting finding I had was also that the returning migrants, of course, often undertook comparisons between their home community and the migration destinations. And because the destinations were often in the very stressful urban settings of Accra, Kumasi, and so on, many people actually kind of rediscovered positive characteristics of their hometown, which then led to also an increasing level of belonging and place attachment, and also increased positive perceptions of habitability. For example, when you look at the trip to Accra, it rather increased my attachment to this place. The job is very risky in nature, and the prospects of having a safe and peaceful area here in the community, I was realizing that more and more. So I'm very happy to be here now, and my attachment has grown. So ultimately, this relevance of place attachment in the context, and also the fact that through place attachment, many benefits of migration are actually redirected to the community, to improve the community, for many people led to positive perceptions of habitability. And lastly, I want to speak about social status, another very important social cultural kind of dimension or category. And there's a lot of people with a high social status. You can earn it from age, also socioeconomic status, but also migration, because people that migrate are considered as travelers that have gained knowledge and experience. And during one of the participatory walking journals, we told one respondent to show us places in the community where we can see impacts of migration on social status, so where we can actually visibly see it in the community. And we were led to 3 different households. These images are not the originals, but the first one on the left-hand side is a household that belonged to a migrant who was returning unsuccessfully. So he was not able to bring any benefits to the community and to his household. And as a result, he was rather shamed. He was even shy to go out of his house for at least 2 or 3 weeks. And in the end, this resulted in a decrease of his social status. In the middle, we have a household, another household, where the migrant was more successful. And after his return, he was able to furnish his room very nicely. He brought a lot of gadgets from his stay in the urban area. And as a result, he also received a lot, like a higher social status, and was more rewarded with admiration. And on the right-hand side, you can directly see this very salient and big structure. And this migrant was ultimately most successful. He was able to build this huge structure for his household. He was also able to bring home a motorbike and rode it very proudly through his community. And ultimately, this migrant received the highest social status and the highest recognition, which for him also meant that his perception of habitability increased. As you can imagine, if you are well perceived in the community, if you are admired and you have a high position in the community, you will perceive the place to be more habitable for you. So ultimately, this migration-induced social status leads to positive perceptions of habitability, not only for the people holding the social status, but also for those profiting. For instance, sometimes you're not able to get more from your farm, but then you know that there are certain people in the community that you can go to and visit. They have a high social status from migration. They can support you. If you do not have these people in the community, you are hopeless and have no one to turn to, and it is definitely worse for you. Good. Quickly coming to the conclusions. So as Simon also mentioned already, perceptions of habitability are very important to look at, especially to go beyond rather objective accounts of habitability based on biophysical standpoints. And these perceptions are subjective, socially differentiated, and shaped by the respective social cultural context. Migration then can impact these perceptions both to positive and negative ends. And ultimately, this social cultural context and the interrelation with migration is a very, very crucial aspect, and it plays a big role for populations to consider places to be habitable or not, especially so with increasing environmental challenges. And considering the social cultural context for analyzing perceptions of habitability or doing assessments of habitability in general is very important then to guarantee that adaptive strategies are actually well targeted and well tailored to communities' needs, and especially for ensuring that communities can indeed maintain their desired level of cultural integrity in the process. All right. Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry if I like took a bit more time with the presenting issues, but thank you nonetheless, and looking forward to questions and feedback.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being online. My name is Hélène Benveniste. I'm a postdoc at Harvard University. I work on international environmental policy. This is my co-author, Simona Capisani, who is an assistant professor at Durham University. Simona is a political and environmental philosopher. So today we're kind of going to take kind of an ethical and normative take on this issue. So how did we start about this? So this project really is going to talk about kind of a new normative approach for governing climate mobility. So we're really going to talk about the migration topic here. And I'm going to start with kind of setting the stage. So what do we talk about when we talk about climate-related mobilities? If you look at the media, the kind of dominant narrative that you're going to see often is going to be this kind of one particular focus, in particular on cross-border migration, and especially on cross-border migration from global south countries towards global north countries. But as we all know by now in this room, climate mobilities is not just about cross-border migration. It also includes within-country migration as well as immobility. And if you look at the empirical evidence so far, many of you in this room have contributed to that. Climate change has already been observed to induce either more movement, so going towards the top, or more immobility towards the bottom, but also with various degrees of agency on these outcomes. And so trying to illustrate that with those pictures, if you start from the top left, displacement involves, of course, movement with low levels of agency, but you see it's not the only outcome resulting from climate change. On the top right, this picture illustrates the fact that migration is also a widely used adaptation strategy to climate change impacts. And the bottom two pictures illustrate cases of immobility, with the bottom right one highlighting the option of adapting in situ without having to move if we don't want to. And the one on the bottom left instead showing cases of climate change really depleting resources, leading to cases of immobility with very low levels of agency. But despite this kind of very heterogeneous outcomes that we see in the empirical observations, this is what the current institutional landscape at the global level looks like. In particular, some of the most relevant institutions here are highlighted. So we have the Refugees Convention, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Global Compact for Migration, the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And at this point, I think it's fair to say that all of those institutions really largely focus on movement as opposed to immobility, and most of them actually just focus on cross-border movement. So really not quite covering the heterogeneity that we see happening empirically. So how can we change this governance landscape in order to better address this kind of broader range of climate mobilities that we're seeing? Well, what we thought is that it's actually helpful to get back to fundamental principles when we're thinking about that. And so we turned to kind of an ethical framework, and we're asking the question, what do we think is owed to people whose mobility ends up being affected by climate change, regardless of the direction, and what governance mechanism can actually best fulfill those obligations?
Right. So as some of you may already know, people have tried to answer this question by proposing various different approaches. So we're going to discuss some of the more prevalent ones, about 3 of them, and see if they're sufficient to cover the full empirical reality of climate mobilities. Spoiler alert, we think that they are not. And so we're going to be proposing an alternative framework, what we are referring to as the livability framework, that can address that whole range of climate mobility outcomes. And so the first proposal is refugee status. So it relies on that principle of non-refoulement, which prevents a state from sending refugees back to their home state. Of course, if doing so would leave refugees subject to persecution. And many people have criticized this approach for various reasons. We're adding our voice to that. So in addition to those, we argue that this does not establish obligations to act prior to cross-border movement occurring. And importantly, this leaves out internal migration and immobility considerations. And in this sense, it only generates a responsibility to address ex post claims to protection. Then a second proposal often invokes humanitarian obligations to address climate mobilities, and those are usually grounded by a moral duty to aid. And responsibility in this context is limited to notions of charity. And so on the basis of some sort of state's goodwill, these responses are always responsive rather than preemptive. So harm has to be having already occurred for responsibility to manifest. Finally, a third key approach is loss and damage. We've already heard from some of our speakers. This is currently the only way in which climate mobility is addressed within the context of the Paris Agreement. And it's relatively new, right? Last November, countries have agreed to set up a new fund for loss and damage. And so it's still a work in progress, and its relationship to adaptation is still unsettled. Yeah, it seems that as it currently stands, L&D is limited to addressing just ex post claims to protection. And like the other approaches, therefore, that normative scope of L&D is currently too narrow to address the full range of climate mobility outcomes. And so instead, we propose another normative framework that provides a principled approach to address that full range of climate mobility outcomes that Alain spoke about. And this framework is based on what we call a right to livable space. So, why is there a right to livable space? This right emerges from the way that we've actually organized the global international world order, namely the Westphalian territorial state system, which divides all inhabitable land under some state-based set of authorities, the organizational purpose of which is to achieve certain goals like peace, stability, and the protection of basic rights. So are you hearing the feedback? Oh, that's okay. I love hearing my own voice. Absolutely not. But thank you for that. Hence, any exclusion within the state system has to be justified in light of those principal aims. And so it's exclusion from the system that actually leads to a failure to secure such aims, then the actual legitimacy of the state system can be brought into question. So what is new about this kind of organizational, form within the context of climate change? Under conditions of climate change, traditional ways of guarding against exclusion from the state system may no longer be sufficient. And it's under these new conditions that the right to a livable space becomes more apparent, and protecting it is necessary for the state system to be legitimate. Okay, so what do we mean by livable space after understanding that kind of basic emergent framework? We argue that people are not merely existing in some static way within space, right? Rather, they're occupying space in a type of relational way, adapting their bodies to the spaces that they occupy, as well as adapting those spaces to their needs and wishes. And so, right, I as an individual or as a member within the context of a community must be able to both shape my and our environment and not just be shaped by it. And so livability is thus valuable in its own right and also necessary to avoid exclusion from the state system and the kinds of benefits it affords. So when climate change renders people's homes uninhabitable, exclusion of this sort is what's happening, and people are at risk of being left with nowhere to effectively be. Right, so hence securing the right to a livable space is a necessary guiding principle of the territorial state system itself, because if we fail to protect that right to livable space, the system is not legitimate on its own self-imposed terms. And so why is this right to a livable space well suited for addressing climate mobilities? We see at least 3 reasons. First, the right ensures that people keep that reflexive relationship to space. So therefore, it's not just restricted to outcomes of displacement. For instance, it also grounds, right, establishes a requirement to increase the agency of immobile populations so that the choice to stay actually remains. And second, the right to livability provides grounds not solely for ex post protection, but also for preemptive protection. And so, for instance, it requires facilitating voluntary migration if migration decreases that risk of exclusion. And finally, the third reason is that the right to livability or livable localities bypass controversial issues of responsibility. Why, you may ask? In part because responsibility on this account is addressed to the state system itself, not in any one given state. And this is because when that right is violated, it's not due to any one state's failure to act, but rather due to the structure of the state system itself under climate stress. And so there are 2 benefits of this model of responsibility. First, responsibility does not rely on any strict causal attribution to any given mobility outcome to climate change. Secondly, responsibility does not rely on the attribution of climate change to any given state's actions. So we take this to be good news, right? Because it's avoiding going back to the sort of substantial stalling debates that have plagued international climate negotiations for a while. And so because this responsibility to uphold the right is borne by the state system as a whole, a governance mechanism at the international level arises as a key necessary element for addressing climate mobilities.
And I'm going to talk a little bit about what we think which international government scheme we think might be best for implementing this right to livable space. So among the institutions that I mentioned earlier as being relevant for climate mobilities, what we argue is that we think the Paris Agreement on climate change might be actually best suited. Well, why? Exactly for the same reasons that we think the livability framework is most fitting for addressing climate mobilities. So the first reason is because we think the Paris Agreement really has the potential to include both movement and e-mobility, as well as to uphold both ex-ante and ex-post claims for protection. These two benefits don't come out of nowhere. They're not offered by other agreements. They're not offered by other institutions, and they're due to specific features of the Paris Agreement. In particular, the Paris Agreement explicitly includes both adaptation and loss and damage by now as pillars of the climate change regime. And so by doing so, the Paris Agreement gets to cover measures that both address harms resulting from negative climate change impacts on mobility outcomes such as immobility with low degrees of agency or displacement, as well as measures that would prevent those harms from occurring. For instance, facilitating voluntary migration or outcomes that would increase the agency of immobile populations. Now, the second benefit, we argue, of the Paris Agreement is that it has been designed explicitly in a way to deal with responsibility in a way that is going to mirror the livability framework. That is, in particular, without having to rely on identifying specific countries that would be causally responsible for a given outcome. And this handling of responsibility in Paris was really I guess the outcome of perhaps the largest incremental success in climate change governance in the history of the regime, with a shift from the sole historical principle of common but differentiated responsibilities that was present already in the original UN Framework Convention in '92 to a much more bottom-up approach to differentiation of efforts illustrated by the nationally determined contributions. Now, do we think that the Paris Agreement in its current state is ready to address the full issue of climate mobilities? Well, we don't think so. The reason for that is because we discussed that the Paris Agreement only addresses climate mobilities currently only as a matter of loss and damage. And right now, so far, loss and damage really seems to not account for immobility outcomes resulting from climate change, for instance, nor for preemptive claims for protections. So how might the Paris Agreement need to change in order to better address the broader range of climate mobilities? Well, to answer this question, we actually are going to need to address current ambiguities in how loss and damage is being talked about. And that's what Kamal was saying again Tuesday night on the opening session. So for instance, what loss and damage measures might look like in practice and how they might actually really differ from adaptation measures is really not clear at this point. Another aspect is the question of attribution of responsibility under loss and damage. In particular, the notion of loss and damage being a basis for compensation is still very much in the air, and I would argue not settled yet. So as a result, the future of loss and damage implementation, and therefore of climate mobilities management within the Paris Agreement, is still undecided. And so here, how can we resolve those ambiguities surrounding loss and damage so that we can better address climate mobilities? Well, we're going to propose two paths forwards for that. The first possible revision of the Paris Agreement is going to adhere closely to the current understanding of what loss and damage is and what adaptation is. So that is, we're going to keep those definitions, but if we do that, we are going to have to not restrict climate mobilities to loss and damage, and rather we're going to have to use both the adaptation pillar and the loss and damage pillar for that. So following that approach, the ex-ante claims to protection would be about adaptation, whereas the kind of retrospective and reparative approach would be about loss and damage. Now, there might be potential limits of this approach, in particular the risk of missing out on a few climate mobility outcomes that would end up not being accounted by either. A second option, the opposite option here would be to instead expand the concept of loss and damage in a way that would allow it to englobe the full range of climate mobility outcomes. But in order to do that, loss and damage would need to include forward-looking options that would otherwise be qualified as adaptation measures. We also see limits to that approach. In particular, first, We know there are ongoing conversations on where contributions to the Loss and Damage Fund should come from. It seems to be already an issue, and so it's not clear that funds would be available for the full range. They might be and end up limited to the most severe cases. And the second, perhaps, limit to that is that considering a much more expensive notion of loss and damage might make really harder to use this loss and damage concept as a basis for compensation in the future, which is something that's very important, in particular for lower income countries. So if you start to wrap up here what we've been saying, we started really with the claim that the current primary focus of the international institutional landscape on climate mobility really is inconsistent with the empirical evidence documenting the effects of climate change on mobility. And so instead, what we did was to propose a normative framework that helps both guide and evaluate governance schemes for climate mobility. And that framework is based on this right to a livable space. It can account both for obligation to address migration and immobility and recognizes both ex ante and ex post claims to protection. Now, we have showed that the Paris Agreement provides a potential avenue for applying this right to a livable space. You can use several mechanisms to do that. But what we're saying is that right now, it cannot do so in its current state. And so we propose two ways forward that would ensure that climate mobilities are fully covered under the Paris Agreement. So far, we actually remain agnostic as to which of those two paths forwards would make more sense. But what we're saying, it's probably too soon to tell at this point, but what we're saying is that loss and damage will require clarification before being implemented. And hopefully we think our framework, by centering this right to a livable space, offers a way to do that. And so given that loss and damage has had a lot of momentum recently in the past couple of years, I think there's an opportunity here to better address climate mobilities as part of the Paris Agreement in a way that really goes beyond what it currently does. And so we're looking forward to conversations afterwards. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lizzie Arena. I'm a doctoral candidate in urban studies and planning at MIT. Thank you all for being here. I'll be presenting some work based on my ongoing doctoral research, and since it is very much work in progress, I just asked not to screenshot or photograph the slides until they're ready to kind of be permanently out in the world. So I'll be talking today about part of my dissertation focusing on maps, habitability, and climate adaptation planning in Vietnam's Mekong Delta. And so to kind of start with a bit of an anecdote, these maps are from a 2019 sea level rise model, which was pretty widely circulated in the media, which purported to use a more accurate form of satellite measurement in order to project that places like Vietnam's Mekong Delta would, including many others around the world, would be all but inundated by sea level rise by 2050. And when I began my preliminary field work, I began to ask experts in Vietnam about these projections. What did they mean for the future of the Delta? And these experts from the Delta or from nearby Saigon had a number of critiques of these projections. But one that really stood out to me was that the assumption that a map like this, so the far one is the one showing the revised projection by 2050, the idea that there would be kind of no modification of the landscape, that sea level rise would be kind of a passive recipient, the Delta would be a passive recipient of sea level rise. And it also suggests that a stark line can be drawn between land and water. And that's something that just a few days in the Delta would call into question. During the annual flood pulse, huge expanses of the Delta are inundated. But in the same place, when the flood pulse subsides, that area becomes naturally fertilized rice paddies. And near the coast, there are huge zones that were once dense with mangrove swamps that are now parcelized into shrimp ponds. Both of those, of course, being very wet geographies. So in my dissertation, I'm looking at how the tools that experts use, especially distant experts, see risks and regions and how that then shapes their approaches to climate change adaptation. And because the map is never the territory, there's always a kind of gap between a representation and reality. I'm especially interested in that gap and how it becomes operationalized. So in this presentation, I'll consider especially this relationship in the context of habitability, questions of who can live where and how, in a delta that's often depicted as among the most vulnerable in the world to rising seas. So I'm talking here especially about maps, which theoretically I think are a productive lens for a couple of reasons. First, as tools of representation, they're ways of seeing a complex space that's not easily accessible to our human faculties. And as representations, they're also tools for building coalitions and consent, whether that's through data or as boundary objects. Second, maps are operative. They reshape social and material conditions through these mechanisms of garnering power and shaping plans. And they may, in some cases, remake the world in their image, but in others, attempting to kind of make the world align with the map may have the opposite effect. The world kind of acts back. And so maps do things, but they don't necessarily do the things that are in the map. So as a kind of quick orientation, Vietnam's Mekong Delta and Southeast Asia. We're at the kind of end of the Mekong River Basin, which travels through 7 countries before reaching Vietnam. And I won't talk too much about my methods, but I'm drawing on a multi-sited spatial ethnography based on one kind of primary year of field work in Vietnam, but also tracing the watersheds and expert sheds of this planning process. So one of the kind of main plans I'm looking at, and what I'll be talking about today, is this document, the Mekong Delta Integrated Regional Plan. It was launched in 2022 and authored by the Dutch consulting firm Royal Haskoning, DHV. It's funded by the World Bank, and the client is the Vietnam Ministry of Planning and Investment. And this is an interesting plan to look at for a few reasons. It's the first document produced under a new planning law, and also under a new government resolution on sustainable development for the Delta. There's a kind of explicit focus on adaptation to climate change, and also it's a regional planning document, so it spans multiple provinces, and it's an integrated plan, so it's also planning multiple sectors. And this plan is actually part of a much kind of longer legacy of Dutch-authored plans for Vietnam's Mekong Delta, through which there are kind of continuous networks, which I start to map here, of international expertise, donor finance, and the interests of various government sectors and ministries. So a delta is big. It's not something that one person can really see. And so these experts who are doing this planning process rely on ways of representing the delta through things like maps and models as ways to plan. And this is especially important because the people who are doing this planning are, in general, from outside the delta, either from northern Vietnam or from abroad. And maps were really central to the planning process, as well as to how this plan was presented to the world. So this is the launch, a photo from the launch of the Mekong Delta Integrated Regional Plan in 2022, and they're kind of broadly displayed. The first thing you see when you entered the lobby of the event was this series of large format maps. And for the planners, mapping was framed as a key methodology for planning for the future of this delta. So they drew on landscape architects like Ian McHarg and Dirk Simons to propose that by overlapping maps and data layers, the challenges, conflicts, or opportunities become visible and can become analyzed for different thematic topics between now and in the future. So this this is also from one of the planning documents, and well, the quote and these images kind of suggests that the work of stacking, patching, and aligning spatial data can shape, if not reveal, an appropriate plan. We kind of see these different maps funnel forward, and eventually we kind of get the proposed recommendations. And one of the key organizing devices of this 2022 Integrated Regional Plan is what they call an agroecological zone. And this becomes a kind of organizing device for the types of agricultural activities that are proposed as suitable in what places. So you can see here that there are 3 what they're calling water resources zones. An upper delta zone, which has continuous fresh water throughout the year, an intermittent fresh and brackish water zone. So during the flood pulse, that would be fresh water, and during the dry season, saline water creeps further inland, and then a coastal saline zone, which is more continuously saline or brackish water. And then you can see that those correspond to 7 or 8 different agricultural zones, which are explained as being adapted to these different hydrological conditions. And as this quote from one of the planners involved suggests, these zones were derived from the delta's natural conditions. And he's saying that following nature gives you the most efficient way to organize the delta. And actually, if we look back at that legacy of plants that I showed earlier, there was a key mapping performed a key function of determining what kinds of agricultural production were suitable for the land and water resources of the delta, and then what kinds of infrastructure would be needed in order to kind of exploit those possible agricultural futures. So this 1993 plan by the Dutch consortium de Deco analyzed suitability based on the irrigation infrastructure potential of different parts of the delta. And then this actually is often characterized as kind of being the key founding document for shaping many large-scale infrastructure projects that happened over the following 20 or so years. And you can see, so the black lines with the hatch, those are the infrastructure projects, and you can see that they facilitated rice to come all the way close to the coastal zone in areas that would have traditionally been mangroves or intermittently brackish. And that also even accommodates up to 3 seasons of rice per year, which is a pretty intensive rice production. So if we go next to the 2013 Dutch-authored Mekong Delta Plan, this plan actually didn't have a legal status. It was produced by the Dutch through this aid and trade initiative, but it still became important in shaping subsequent World Bank projects. And it characterizes 3 much simpler zones as an upper, middle, and lower delta. And so here in the 2016 World Bank project, which has a very long title, used this kind of zone, this hydrological zoning, as an organizing device to prioritize what kinds of projects they would fund through the loan. The loan was $310 million. So different kinds of infrastructure and agricultural practices were again characterized as suitable for these different upper, middle, and lower delta, coastal delta regions. So bringing us back to the most recent integrated plan, the 2020 draft of the plan, which was written by several of the same authors actually as the 2013 plan, uses the language of the agroecological zone. And as these quotes from the plan suggest, the agroecological zoning derives not only from some pre-existing natural conditions, but also from ideas about how the future of the delta should be, and importantly, shifting the agricultural or the ecological conditions of the delta in the process. So namely, there's a kind of idea of what should be there, which is derived from the landscape, and then it is kind of imposed on the landscape through water control infrastructure, basically solidifying those zones that emerge through the mapping analysis. But one of the main interventions in the final version of the plan is through this zoning, we see kind of a shifting over time periods. So on the left, we have 2030, on the right, we have 2050, and then blue is freshwater zones, purple is saline, and then the light purple would be intermittent brackish and freshwater. And so basically, these maps show that the proposed agroecological zoning for 2030 on the left and 2050 on the right is that over time, there would be a shift from fresh to brackish water in these zones. And this, of course, entails a transformation of livelihood on the ground, namely a transformation from rice and other crops to brackish water aquaculture, which would primarily be shrimp. If we look back then at the infrastructure coming out of earlier plans, we can actually see that although we might see this characterized as an adaptation to climate change, something that's happening in the future, this is really in many ways a backtracking of past infrastructure projects that again stemmed from earlier planning processes that also used the lenses of mapping suitability of land and water resources to specific agricultural systems. And so what does that kind of mean when these changing ideas about what should happen where hits the ground? Though these plans often use language about sustainable aquaculture, the primarily brackish water practice that is happening in the delta is shrimp farming, which is a pretty economically risky and also expensive practice that has a very different political economy than rice. So to kind of return to this framing of representations and engines, how does this vision of the rezoned delta shape conceptions of its habitability? This is kind of a closing reflection and maybe incomplete because, again, this is a dissertation in progress. So as we saw, past studies of the of what the delta was suitable for changed its infrastructural systems and in turn the ways in which it was inhabited. And while it's too early to say exactly what this plan is going to do, we could look to the planners themselves to ask how they believe it will shape the way that the delta is going to be lived in the future. So for people like this Dutch expert, the plan's maps were engines, ways of envisioning and implementing a new infrastructure and agricultural system. So here he's speaking of a coastal road that he thought should not be built because it was in a vulnerable coastal zone, but he's saying here they want to have it in the plan, even if it's a bad idea in that location. You know, it's good for other reasons, maybe economic reasons, but it might be a bad idea for sustainability. But he's saying if it's in the plan, it's going to happen. And take that in contrast to this quote from one of the Vietnamese consultants involved, who is, for him, the kind of way forward for the delta is envisioned as aligning with nature by doing less and building less. And so he says, you have to read what's in the plan, or read what's behind the plan. The plan will be revised every 10 years, so they can revise it when there is more awareness. The important thing is to not build anything in the next 10 years. So he kind of saw the process of drawing lines on the map as a counter engine, as a way of avoiding rather than building the future depicted on paper. And this idea of drawing infrastructure with the purpose of not building, which is often depicted in the views of advocates from the Delta itself, is especially interesting in the context of a movement towards not building or unbuilding infrastructure as a way to live differently in the context of an unpredictable environmental change associated with climate change, but also the consequences of past infrastructure decisions. Though, of course, both of these visions of the future have important implications for who can live in the Delta and how. So I'm going to stop there with a quick thank you to many who have supported the work, and thank you to all of you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Great presentations for Ellen, and I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, Simona. So I think I was really fascinated by your presentation. It does present, I think, a potential way forward to do, fund this kind of work. I was on a conversation the other day where Salami El-Houk was talking about how he wants to levy taxes on air flights and the oil industry profits to basically fund much more of the necessary investments needed to avert loss and damage. But how are you going to define livability? I'm sure you've thought about that a lot. And so who's the international arbiter of what's a livable space? Someone living in a slum, is that livable? Someone living in a very dryland environment, is that livable? So I think that's an important criteria that's going to need to be figured out.
Yep.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll start with that. So in some of my work is where I'm building out the livability conception. And so when we're defining it as a right to a livable locality, first just wanted to talk about the right framework that we're using. We're understanding it as a basic right, so a la Henry Shue, where the protection and security of that right enables the protection and security of a whole host of other rights. So just wanted to flag that first. In terms of the livability conception, the way that we're articulating it is understood, borrowing some of the work from the capabilities approach. So understanding livability actually as a type of functioning. So there's distinctions between capabilities and functionings. We didn't go into this obviously with the length of the talk. Capabilities are sort of the opportunities to be, right, yeah, just I'll leave it there. But functionings are the achievements of a particular state of being. And so there's a general framework that is being put forward, right, in some of the publications I've been doing that we're working on, which is to articulate the general framework as that type of functioning, but allowing kind of context-specific criteria that then helped to beef that concept up when you're looking at particular concepts, right? But the underlying sort of unifying aspect there is to say, what sorts of hosts of capabilities are afforded to be able to achieve a particular state of being within the context of the state system where these kinds of forms of exclusion might occur. So where there's that breakdown of a co-constitutive relationship to space, meaning if people are only impacted by the kinds of infrastructure that is there, or whether they're only kind of having like a unidirectional fit in terms of what's being imposed on them, as opposed to that kind of reflexive relationship. And that then requires looking at, of course, a host of material resources that go into the requirement to meet that kind of functioning being achieved, but so are immaterial consequences. So I talk a lot about certain epistemic institutional frameworks that need to assure that certain kinds of local knowledge allows the kind of institutional infrastructural development in an area. So we're really trying to start for how can you have a more general framework, which you need maybe on an international governance level, but also can be flexible enough to have those kinds of context-specific definitions without it devolving in a kind of relativism. And so something that was really important with how we were developing this framework is that you have a principle-based approach, right? And that can lead to certain kinds of pathways of consensus. So I'm happy to elaborate more, but it's really in understanding livability as an achievement, as a functioning of being within a particular way, within the context of the state system. And just to flag on that important point, we didn't really want a kind of moral framework that imposes maybe more controversial notions like a natural rights framework, right? Like run some Lockean proviso mechanism. Instead, we actually wanted to see that this is a principle of guidance that if you understand and have buy-in in certain kinds of commitments of the state system, this emerges in an internal regulative principle. And so the idea is that if you already have these certain kinds of commitments and structures, this actually falls out as a legitimacy condition, and that's why it puts people on the hook for the funding. So hopefully that starts to get that. But
Yeah, just to complete that, on the very concrete question of which institution would define what livability is, I think what we're saying kind of joins a couple of the Ghana presentations by Simone and Jan online, meaning that livability cannot be defined in kind of a uniform top-down way, because the way we define, livability is almost interchangeable with habitability in that sense, because of the way we define the livability aspect. It has to be about the lived experience of people so that they can not just be shaped by their environment, but also be able to shape it. And that's a very local, individual level dynamic. And so I assume from a concrete perspective, it's not super satisfying because we're not giving a very all size fits all answer about what livability is. And to be honest, I don't see a very obvious way in which a given international institution would say, this is a livable condition, this is not a livable condition.
I will add, there is some precedence if you look at how SENS work within the capabilities frameworks operated in that context. So there is some ways in which you can think of livability as a type of threshold state where, but instead of it being included in the set of livability or in the set of capabilities, it actually can say, well, this is the criteria of what an achieved functioning is, and at least could start to establish that. But that, like you're saying, the specific details of that, what fills out that criteria, has to be context sensitive. So it's a way to kind of try to have, like we said, this generalizable principle, an actual guidance mechanism, while also allowing that bottom-up participation.
We have time just for one more question. Very sorry.
We're happy to stay if people want to keep asking questions.
Sorry.
Hello, thanks for the presentation. So I have two questions. First question is for Jan, the presentation North Ghana. In your research, I'm glad that you've mentioned your research that migration has implications for social status. In your research, are you observing chain effect, or for instance, or role modeling effect? Those who are moving increases probability of movement for those who are not yet moving. In other words, improves the prospects for migration for those who are not yet leaving or migrating. Or chain migration, those friends and relatives who haven't moved yet, the propensity of them moving increases or decreases. So that's the first question. And second question for Helen and Simone. So yeah, I like the idea of the right to livable space. And in fact, this reminds me of the debate on right to development, right? Because there are many issues hurled against the right to development. Like say there are economic, social, and cultural rights, and the right to development is embedded within these agglomeration of rights. Some quarters say that's the reason why we're proposing right to development, because they are insufficient. The current set of rights are insufficient. So my question is, what are the counter arguments you're anticipating, no, on this proposal for a right to livable space, and how would you respond to those counter arguments?
Jan?
All right, yeah, thank you very much for the question. So indeed, I was looking at social status in more detail also, and just presented a few findings. But social status is really a very important kind of category, and people really in Northern Ghana in this community have valued people with social status, and it was very much an issue in the community, and many people were striving to actually gain and receive this kind of social status and the recognition that comes with it, the social position that comes with it. And migration is kind of a shortcut to receive such a social status, because usually it comes with age, it comes with wealth, and it comes with experience. But if you have been on migration, then you can have the shortcut to have this position. And of course, this also led to the fact that more people wanted to also gain the status and wanted to use migration as a way to improve their social position. But on the other hand, what I also found kind of interesting, and this balances the migration movements a bit, is the fact that the attachment is very high. So people have a very strong place attachment to their home community, and with this place attachment, people also aim to improve the community, to give something back, to build structures. And ultimately, what people told me, you can only have a social status, a high one, if you show it in the community. So if you kind of give something back, if you build something, if you return and show your material gains, your experience gains. And so this kind of meant that indeed many people were opting for migration, and many people wanted to also gain a social status. But on the other hand, many people indeed returned to then show the status and to kind of improve the prospects in the community and to render it more habitable ultimately. So it kind of still had positive effects, although maybe more people were then also striving to migrate.
I'll go very briefly, and we can talk more. Thank you for the question. The question of what would be counter arguments to right to livable space. I think there are so many. I mean, from a practical standpoint, a very obvious one is the notion when you kind of push forward a right is who is on the hook for supporting it. And in particular, in the case of a livable space or habitability, it's often a matter of dollars also. Who is on the hook for paying whatever, thing needs to happen to keep the space habitable or livable or make it habitable or livable again. It's probably very hard to not fall again in the whole conversation that has, underlined the climate negotiations for so many years. So you mentioned the right to development, the question of, who has which right to develop and by how much and by when, and who is supposed to pay for what. The Paris Agreement was kind of this very miraculous, unstable equilibrium of we're just talking little enough about responsibility that we're able to kind of all be in the room together and slightly move forward maybe. So I think perhaps a biggest challenge surrounding the implementation of a right to livable space would be to get back into this very kind of dance-like move of, who is okay, because we're saying the whole state system is responsible for it, but in practice, what does that look like and who agrees to, be involved? So a practical challenge would be like this kind of dance-like implementation.
And I mean, I'll just add really quickly, the sort of underlying normative challenge that goes with that practical challenge is if states claim, well, these kinds of obligations putting us on the hook for some sort of shared financial, scheme somehow are violations of state sovereignty. So that's actually an objection that I take really seriously. And part of the way to guard against that objection in the view is to say that, look, because this is like a right that's emerging out of the social practice of the state system, is its own internal regulation principle, in which case, in order to claim the whole set of other rights that the state system's organizational structure affords you, like sovereignty, right, you need to be able to satisfy these legitimacy conditions. And insofar as there are cases in which the right is violated, the very legitimacy of the practice itself is no longer being able to be claimed. And therefore, there are constraints on appeals to state sovereignty, much like, in fact, the Refugee Convention in principle was supposed to have, right? And so there's a kind of parallel there where if people are to say not the context of responsibility, there's an answer to say this right is not putting a legitimacy constraint that's anything external to already what has been bought in. So that's a way to at least start those conversations about without having to devolve into particular kind of finger pointing right away. So